Good evening and welcome to the June 21st, 2022 meeting of the MW&L Water and Light Commission. I'll call the meeting to order. Trina, will you please do a roll call?
Yes, Mayor Dropkin,
Here.
Commissioner Tankerslade,
Here.
Commissioner Gormley. I see him, he is here. Commissioner Christensen is excused this evening, and Commissioner Tate.
There he is.
Great, thank you. We have 7 items listed on the consent agenda. Would any commissioners like to remove any of the items on the consent agenda?
Madam Mayor, I think we're going to ask, staff is going to ask that item number G, the sidewalk easement, be removed from the consent agenda.
Right. Are there any other items we'd like to? Great, so we'll remove that and put that under new business. Are there any other items?
I'll move for the adoption.
One moment before you do, are there any other items anybody'd like to remove? If not, I would like to either not vote on the minutes as I wasn't present or remove them, whatever you recommend.
You certainly can abstain from voting because we otherwise have a quorum to approve. But do you want to abstain from the entire consent agenda or just
Just the minutes?
Just the minutes. Okay, maybe it needs to be two motions in. A motion to approve the minutes, which could be handled by the quorum present, and then a second motion for the remainder of the consent agenda.
Wonderful. So I'd now entertain a motion first to approve the minutes of the April 26th and May 17th, 2022 minutes. Wait,
I'll second.
a first and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion passes unanimously, and I'll now entertain a motion to approve the remainder of the consent agenda.
So moved.
The motion? Second. Second, thank you. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? I guess I should have answered that. And the motion passes unanimously. Included in the packet are accounts payable and purchasing reports. Are there any questions on these reports?
No questions from me.
No.
Next, we'll have consultant and partner reports. Brent Keller Forrester, please update the commission on forest management activities.
Brent, you there? You're muted, Brent.
Thank you. Good evening. You hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, we're in full swing on both stumpage sales for this year. Powerline West is being logged by Ashley Logging. They're cutting, logging, and trucking from that sale, which was purchased by Murphy. About 30 loads have gone out so far on that sale. Around 135,000 board feet have been shipped, and estimated value to date a little over $100,000. Powerline East is a little more complex sale with some steeper ground. Keep in mind, both these sales are on either side of the power lines. And Stella Jones bought Powerline East. Dave Dober Construction's logging that one, and a lot of poles coming off of that sale. So that's a real high value sale. 65 loads have been shipped to Stella and other destinations so far. We look to be well on track to cut out over 2 million feet on that sale and end up with a value of around $2 million. And so keep in mind, these two sales were designed to mitigate, prevent fire risk in relation to the power line. So between these two sales and then some other additional salvage logging and cleanup we're doing along the power lines this year, we'll take care of 99% of all the trees that could potentially reach the power lines through blowdown or other types of events. So this will greatly improve the fire readiness in the watershed. And also road maintenance and silviculture projects are both currently underway for both sales. Any questions?
Question for you, Brent. Fire season, do you have a date when they anticipate starting?
I heard even when it was seemingly going to rain all summer, I heard they were still looking at July 1 for that. So I'd anticipate that. And both loggers have their fire equipment out there already anyway, because it's just a matter of time until they're going to need it. So
Other questions? Do these two different contracts cover the entire length of the power line where it crosses McMinnville Water and Light property?
Yeah, that's the goal.
That's
no,
No.
they're just the larger merchantable mature stands that were on either side, and then
Right.
there's other timberland either side, but it's younger growth stuff. So
It's not up here.
And, you know, it's good when people divide up.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are no appearance requests on the agenda tonight. There is one staff report on the agenda. Chad, please update the commission on your report.
Good evening. Well, update on the fuel station project. It is going well, but it's been slowed for a few reasons. Most of it's getting materials in. Anderson Environmental, the contractor, is waiting for the steel or the tanks, the fuel tanks to arrive. They were hoping it was gonna be the week of the 4th. Today, I heard week of the 11th, July 11th, so it keeps on getting pushed back a little bit here and there. They will be installing the canopy, so if you drive by, you'll see a couple supports up there. They will be installing the canopy next week, so that'll be happening. They have installed the dispensers, which isn't on here, so those are in. I think they're kind of more scratching for things to do out there. Another thing is the installation of the sidewalk and the approach out there has been put on hold due to the easement. But outside of that, it's going well. So far right now, we're on track for middle of August. Won't take much once they get the fuel tanks in. We'll go commissioning. We have to fill up the tanks third full for testing purposes, but things are going well. We're getting close. All the paving and all the concrete work inside the fence is complete. So
Thank you.
that's where we're at.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, Chad, do we have the fuel supply lined up already?
It's through a state contract.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
So we should be good there. Well, price won't be good, but
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
as far as supply it will be.
And are the tanks that you're waiting on, are they import or
No.
produce? No,
They're pretty, they're domestic. So we're gonna have 3 tanks. We're gonna have 2 diesel and 1 gasoline. 2 12,000 tanks for 12,000 gallon tanks for diesel and an 8,000 for gasoline. So, and we do have a dispenser out there for high volume. With the intention of filling up our fuel truck, and if we have an emergency, we can fill our generators up. So that'll be really nice to have on site.
Is one of the diesel tanks off-road and one on-road?
Nope.
No.
They'll
So
be the same.
we,
They'll be on road,
okay. 'Cause we don't have that much off-road, do we?
not very
Just,
much.
you know, just the generators.
Except the generators, right? Yeah, okay, okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
You know, when you want to stay there.
I'll just stay here.
Then you come off and set it up.
Sure. As there is no old business, we are going to move into new business. Do you want me to put G right up at the top then? G that came off the consent agenda in front of the public hearing?
I think that's what Mr. Dietz is requesting. We
Yeah.
don't address item G, approval of sidewalk easement. And that's, I think Mr. Hudson has a memo. It's on page 31 of the packet that's in your materials under design build fuel station sidewalk easement.
Yeah, so we've gone back and forth with the city, kind of ironed out an easement document they have in front of you. And through the whole thing, there was some question as to where the existing right of way lies on the what side would that be? On the west side of Marsh Lane. And the reason that's important is because we're going to be adding potentially a 6-foot easement on top of the right of way. And we wanted to ensure that we were not going to encroach into our fence line. And so last week we didn't have the information that we needed. And so we had a legal description that we thought was good. And then we got some different information from the survey that came back, and it basically we found out that if we went with the legal description we have in here, we'd be encroaching on our fence by about half a foot on the gate side. So obviously not good. So we went back to our surveyor, and they are doing a new legal description and meets and bounds description that basically describes the particular parcel in question and exclude the fence line. And so that's why we wanted to pull it off tonight, because the exhibit they have in the packet will be different, as well as the legal description.
So are we looking for a motion to move this to a future agenda?
No, we'd seek a motion to approve the sidewalk easement form as proposed with non-substantive changes and revisions to the legal description as approved by Water and Light Council, and otherwise authorizing the mayor and the clerk to sign. So we'd ask for discretion to essentially allow staff to insert that description that we get from the surveyor and go ahead and get it done.
Are there any questions before we call for a motion?
Yeah, and so Sam and Chad, that would be the easement that the city wants, and the city wants an easement all the way to the fence.
Essentially, the proposed sidewalk's going to be almost right up next to the fence line.
Okay.
And so, and that was the right of way is not, it's not parallel to the fence.
Sure.
So, and that's where, on one end, we're fine. But when you get over
Yeah,
to the
okay.
gate to the north end, we're approaching the
And
fence.
will
actually, to
this
it.
be, I remember there was some discussion of we would move the gate or some, make some changes to the gate. Will this interfere with that?
No.
Okay.
That's why we wanted to redo it, because we want to make sure
Yeah.
it doesn't interfere with the
And this-
realignment of the
Right,
gate.
and this is all being coordinated with our design builders, right?
Yes, it was actually, yes, our engineer basically, recommended that we change it, and obviously we thought it was a good idea as well, so.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, any other questions? I'd entertain a motion. So the motion and a second, I think a motion to the effect of
I'll second.
a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please signify by saying nay. And the motion passes unanimously.
Ed, you're on mute. I saw you say yes, but you're on mute.
Aye.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a public hearing on changes to water rates and charges. And it is now 5:14 PM on June 21st, 2022. The time scheduled for public hearing on these water rates and charges was at 5 o'clock. As mayor, I am the presiding officer and will conduct the hearing, impose reasonable time limits on participants, and receive documents and reports into the hearing record. At today's hearing, the commission expects to hear a staff report. During the staff report, I may recognize other members of the commission to ask questions of staff. After the staff report, interested parties will be invited to ask questions. Before stating your question, please state your name and address for the record. Tonight's meeting is being held in a hybrid format, both in person and digitally on Zoom. Since this is a unique and for some a new meeting format, I will now provide an overview of some important procedural items to ensure the meeting runs smoothly for everyone participating. Any interested party that has joined the public hearing in Zoom is automatically set to be on mute and to have their video display hidden. At the appropriate times during the meeting, I will ask those in attendance whether they would like to speak. When this occurs, please select the raise hand option from your device. This can be accessed by hovering your mouse or cursor over the lower part of the screen where a toolbar will pop up. From this toolbar, select participants. This will open another toolbar on the right-hand side of the screen. From that toolbar on the right, you can select raise hand at the bottom of the participants toolbar. When you have selected raise hand, the staff person managing the meeting will know that you would like to ask a question. I will give adequate time at these points during the meeting to ensure that we capture everyone that would like a question of staff. If you're having difficulty using the raise hand feature, you may also use the chat feature to type and state that you would like to speak. This will be monitored by the staff person managing the meeting. If using the chat feature, please note your name and address and confirm that you wish to ask a question of staff about electric rates. If you are calling in via phone and do not have access to the Zoom meeting video and toolbar, please wait until I ask if there is anyone on the phone who would like to ask a question. I will make sure that everyone who wants to participate in the public hearing has the opportunity to do so. After the staff report, the commission anticipates continuing the hearing to September 20th, 2022 for additional comments of interested parties, a final staff report, deliberations of the commission, and adoption of new rates and schedules. No final decision will be made today. To begin, I understand that our finance director, Mr. Mark Dunmeyer, will begin the staff presentation and introduce our rate consultant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the commission. I'm Mark Dunmeyer, Finance Director. We have with us this evening Mark Beauchamp of Utility Financial Solutions. Mr. Beauchamp was commissioned to do a water cost of service analysis for us, and he's here this evening to present that. Mr. Beauchamp is a recognized expert in the field of rate design, and his past reports he has done for the commission have been well received. So with that, we'll turn it over to Mr. Beauchamp to do his presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. I want to just start briefly. I know Mark introduced me, but I want to tell you a little bit more about our company. We were started in 2001. We've been around about 21 years. We've done work in over 40 states, including several islands in the Caribbean, Barbados, Bermuda, Guam. And we've been working with McMinnville for, I think, a little over 10 years. And we do the electric studies and also the water studies. And what I'm going to go through tonight, I'm going to first share my screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So a couple months ago, back earlier this year, we started work on a water cost of service study. And if you're not familiar with the process we go through, we first do a 5-year financial projection. We project out the revenues and the expenses and the change in expenses. And we compare the results to certain key financial targets that I'll review. The 3 financial targets we compare it to is debt coverage ratio, which is not an issue for you, target operating income, and minimum cash reserves. And I'll go through in detail each one of those 3 financial targets. Once we do that, we establish a rate track. And we establish a rate track to accomplish, in a sense, 2 things. One is to keep the utility financially stable, and the other one is to minimize as much as possible any rate impacts on customers. And what you're going to see in the financial projection, what I'll be asking for direction on, is 2 different rate tracks that we developed. They're very similar, but one of them has a rate increase in 2023 and the other one does not. That's the only difference between the 2. Once we completed the financial projection, we then did a cost of service study. What a cost of service study is we take the revenue requirements for the utility. And when I say revenue requirements, what I mean is how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers. And we compare that to the revenues we're projected to receive from that class. And that then identifies how each rate component should change. And we use that in the rate design. We try to take the rate design and move that toward cost of service results in a slow, systematic fashion, again, to try to minimize any impacts on customers. In the process of going through the cost of service study, one of the questions came up and had to do with timber revenue that I'll go through. We ran the cost of service study two different ways. One is where we used the timber revenue and we only used it to offset cost to inside city customers. The other way that we looked at it was we used the timber revenue to offset everybody's cost, including outside city. So that is something that I want to review with you to get your input and feedback on that. I don't think it will really have an impact on the rate design directly, but it will possibly future cost of service studies. The other thing I'll be reviewing is you have an area called Zone 2, which is an area that's higher elevation. And as a result, your entire system right now is currently gravity fed. And because of the elevation, there's going to be pumping costs, and because of that, electric costs, and there's certain upgrades in the system that will be needed to serve this new area. So I want to review the premium that I'm proposing to charge customers that locate in this Zone 2 area. So with that, before I get started on the number side of it, is there any questions about the process that we did?
Mark, this is Tom Tankersley. You said that the timber revenue would offset costs.
Yeah.
Is this different than what we've done before when you've done your cost of service analysis?
It is. In the past, we use the timber revenue to offset everybody's cost. But one of the things, it's something to think about. When it comes to the timber revenue, it was the city of McMinnville and the ratepayers that basically got that property that is generating this revenues. And in later years, the outside city customers started to come on to the system. And the question to me is, should they really be allocated any of that credit for the timber revenue? And that's kind of a decision more for the board. I mean, obviously I have my certain opinion about it, but I look at the city customers as the owners. And I guess I don't necessarily look at as owners outside city customers.
So Mark, I've always thought of the timber revenue as not offsetting operating costs, but is used for capital improvements. And I see Commissioner Gormley shaking his head. He has the same memory.
Mm.
So you propose that we use that money essentially to subsidize water rates and not set it aside for capital improvements?
No, I don't, not that. Where it becomes an issue is when you set rates outside the city limits. What you do with that revenue, if you choose to set it aside, that's a board decision. But from a cost of service perspective, should that revenue be used to reduce the cost or the capital improvement programs that are needed for customers outside the city limits? Because the improvements are made that everybody benefits from. So should those benefits that you accrue from the timber revenue go to customers located outside the city limits?
By this, you mean, for instance, raising the dam? Would that be what you're talking about, or the transmission line improvements?
Yes, it's all of it, really, yes.
Commissioner Gormley? You're muted.
Thank you. Mark, in all the years that you've worked for us, I think that the board has made it clear to you that one of our concerns was, what if we wake up tomorrow and the federal government has put items in place that we can't harvest the timber?
Yep.
And I'm shocked to hear that we're doing anything other than what Tom had talked about previously. Part of the rate study was to get us weaned of the money because of what might happen tomorrow.
Correct.
And we thought there was a lot of wisdom in that. I mean, that's what your charge has been for the past years. So I'm surprised to hear you talk differently.
Well, I'm not really talking differently. I think it'd be easier if I go through the financial modeling, because the question to the board is, to me, this. One is, when we look at minimum cash reserves, we factored in a certain amount of risk associated with the timber revenue and also the loss of a major customer. So the question becomes to the board is, if you lost the timber revenue, what's going to start occurring is you're not going to be putting as much into your cash reserves. And because your cash, once you get into a subsequent slide, you'll see the cash balances. And that then is what's driving our recommendations for an adjustment. And I think you'll see it, Mr. Gormley, when we go through that piece of it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else?
That's
Yeah,
fine.
keep going. All right, let's continue then. Thank you.
All right. The first thing we do when we do a financial projection is we have to build a projection based on certain assumptions. One of them is inflation. Of course, everybody knows, I think the annual inflation rate this past year was by 8.6%. We use 8.5% for this year, 2022. And then we use 5% for 23, 24, 25, and 26. In 27, we dropped it back to a more historical norm, at least for the past 15 years, of 3%. That's one of the assumptions we made. We also projected growth in the system and the capital improvement plan. And the capital improvement plan, you can see, which is over on the pointer here, oops, which is over here, which varies from about 5 million to 7.5 million each year, as far as the capital plan. So now this is the financial projection without any rate adjustments. There we go. So there's no rate adjustments in this projection. And you currently are a debt-free utility, so you don't have to worry about debt coverage ratio. The recommended minimum cash reserves, that's a minimum, not a target, and I'll go through the calculation of this. It's about $10-11 million at a minimum. The projected cash balances without any rate adjustments start off at 22 million, and you're in a slight cash burn situation, not substantial. But in 2027, it's projected to drop down a little over $1 million. From an operating income standpoint, to fully recover the cost of all the infrastructure, the target operating income, which is a little different way of looking at it, it looks at it more like an accountant would look at your cost. Because what we're trying to do there is to fully fund the use and the wear and tear on the infrastructure that customers are using and consuming. You have a very new infrastructure. I think it's about 28% depreciated, so it's very new, which is a real good thing. But your target operating income is 3 to 4 million. Without any rate adjustments, you're running about 3 million, and you drop down to about 2 million in 2027. Now, the way we look at this is we have to set rates so that you maintain cash reserves above the minimum. If you had debt, you have to maintain a certain coverage ratio. The upper boundary, when we establish a rate track, is this target operating income. And what we do is we set a rate track to hit the minimums, which is the debt coverage and the minimum cash reserves, and not exceed the target operating income. So what we did, I'm going to jump over this, I'll come back to it. We set a rate track at 2% a year. The 2% a year, what that does is it keeps your cash relatively stable. So you're at 22 million in 2023. You're able to fully fund your capital improvement program, and your cash balances in 27 are approximately the same at around 23 million. The target operating income, again, that's my upper boundary, is 3 to 4 million, and we're slightly below that each year. So what you're going to see and then is that 2% adjustment throughout the projection and in the rate track. Now, we did run another scenario because one of the requests was to not do anything with rates in 2023 and to do 2% adjustments from 24 to 27. And if you were to do that, you can see the cash balances stay almost exact over that projection period. So in my opinion, whether you have the 2% in 2023 or you delayed it a year, it's not going to have any kind of serious impact on your financial stability. So that's going to be one of the questions. Now, before I go through that, I want to go through some of these financial targets. Most importantly, this minimum cash reserve level or calculation. Now, when we look at a minimum cash reserve, there's basically three things we try to take into account. One is something called working capital lag. And working capital lag is really nothing more than the timing difference between when you pay bills and get money from customers. Give you an example. You may go all through the month of January paying for labor, materials, supplies. And let's say you have one billing cycle. At the end of the month, you read all the meters, send all the bills out the first week of February. You don't actually get that money from customers until the middle of March. So there's that lag time where you spent it in January, but you don't get the money back to March. And we have to have cash in reserves to fund that working capital lag. And we look at that on the operation and maintenance side and also debt service. Now, in the other thing with the working capital that we look at is down here, capital improvements. We want to make sure that you have cash available to fully fund the capital improvement program that you have planned for the year. So that's also put into that minimum cash reserve calculation. Now you see I have three other factors here. One is the timber revenues, because the timber revenue, as Mr. Gormley had mentioned, is we don't always know if we're going to get it. So then the question becomes when we're assessing the risk, and of course, this is our perception of risk, and what's more important is your perception of risk. The timber revenues, what we did is we set aside 1 year of timber revenues into our minimum cash reserve calculation. That's at $2 million. We also set aside about $450,000 for a potential loss of a major customer. In other words, if you lost a large customer, you're going to lose your income statement, your cash flow is going to shrink a little bit. So we wanted to set aside enough in reserves that if that were to occur, we can draw out of our reserves for a year, and that'll give us time to adjust the rates accordingly. And we did that for both the timber revenue and the loss of the major customer. And there's another risk factor that we look at. And that risk factor is an unexpected event or a catastrophic event. And because you have newer infrastructure, we feel you have less exposure to a catastrophic event. And how we can tell you have newer infrastructure is when we look at your plant and we look at the depreciation expense that's been taken out on that plant historically, only 27% of the plant has been depreciated, which indicates that your plant is relatively young compared to the national statistics, which is closer to 50%. So what we did is we assigned you the lowest risk factor against your assets. And that's 1% of your historical investment in assets. And that's more of a recognition that unexpected events occur. So that added another 1.4 million approximately to your cash reserve requirement. So in the bottom line is we need to maintain somewhere between 10 to 11 minimum, 10 to 11 million as a minimum in cash. So we want to be above that. Now, you can see that currently you are above it at 22 million. You're very healthy. The question becomes for the board is how much more do you want to increase these cash reserves? And of course, one of the assumptions I made in our modeling is to try to keep you closer to that $22 million, which in a sense means that the timber revenue, for example, is being used to offset these capital improvement programs. It's being used to fund the capital, which is keeping your cash levels at a higher amount. So with the 2% adjustments, you can see the cash reserve stayed relatively the same throughout the period. And the timber revenue is funding your capital improvement programs. I think that's exactly what Mr. Gormley wanted. Is there any questions before I move on? Because I know that's kind of a key thing.
Okay, do you want to go, Chair Tankersley?
Mark, just to kind of repeat, I think what I learned from you the first time I took a class at APPA from you before we were using it. There are lots of assumptions here that can move numbers quite dramatically. So if you, for instance, if your assumption of the risk, if your assumption about risk were higher, then the minimum capital requirement will be much higher as well, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, a lot of our infrastructure being new has less risk of catastrophe, but we have two assets that are very, very expensive that have a higher risk of catastrophe, right? The two dams.
Yeah.
So I mean, your numbers look like it, but in the past we've had this discussion, and I think, is it fair to say that you would agree that we don't have 2 times the amount of reserves that we ought to have? We're not way over reserved.
No.
Okay.
No, you have a lot of capital coming up and a lot of growth that needs to be funded. And I feel that keeping the cash, at least at the levels that you're at, is a prudent decision. The question from a public's perspective is often, at what point in time is the cash reserves higher than they should? And of course, that's more of a subjective assessment. In my opinion, you're actually right in target if I were to establish a target. But I think what's important is for the board to set and establish a cash reserve policy. And to do that, mainly so the public understands why you need to maintain certain levels of cash reserves. I think from a public's perspective, they don't really understand the operations of a utility and the cash needs the utility has. And a cash reserve policy can be used to help justify the level of cash. Now, if I were on the board, you know more about the community in many ways than I do. I would look at this. What I did in this minimum cash reserve calculation, and give me input and guidance in using this to set it where the board thinks it should be set, for one, and two, to put that then in a policy type format. The board can always, future boards can always modify it if needed, but to put it into a policy format. And the way I look at this is like this. You have, in a sense, to me, about $10 million in operating cash, and you have about $12 million in repair and replacement funds. And I think that that's one of the things that the board may want to consider, if you don't already have one, is to separate your cash into buckets to a degree, so that you designate a certain amount of that reserve as a repair and replacement account. So what that does is it helps from a public's perspective to justify the cash reserves that you have available to you.
May I ask a question of staff? Do we have a cash reserve policy? Sorry, I don't know. No. And then, but the next question would be, would you recommend that policy would be something that the commission adopted in advance of approving rates as one rate or the implementation on these rates?
I don't know if that would necessarily be necessary. I just feel that over the course of the next several months, that the board should look at establishing that policy.
Okay, and Chair Tankersley?
Thank you. Mark, I have a recollection that a few years ago when we did this, you looked at our long-term plans and costs for our alternative water source in the Willamette, and you actually had a trajectory. And I recall that you thought that at some point we should actually borrow money so we don't have to have a huge rate decrease. How does that factor in here, and if I remember it correctly?
Yeah, that's a great question. That didn't get brought up in this analysis, but I remember looking out, and our models run out like 20 years, and looking out into the future at, I don't know if you want to call it worst case scenarios, but potential capital that could exist down the road. And that was, I think, for information in many ways, that from a board's perspective, should we be setting money aside to fund that potential capital that could occur 10 years from now? And also, one of the things, because you don't want to charge, at least not too much, you don't want to charge current ratepayers for infrastructure that's not benefiting them at this point. So even though I would recommend a repair and replacement account that we can justify, I wouldn't necessarily directly charge them for that future capital because it's not used and useful to them. And at the time that capital occurs, I think we should draw down on reserves. And in my example here, it would be $12 million. And then to fund, in a sense, the difference in debt. I know that that's something I was with a board earlier this afternoon, and they kind of had the same philosophy that you have. They don't like to have debt. But debt is it's a tool available to utility that helps to levelize the rates and actually makes them fairer to customers. Because if you wanted to pay for that major capital addition 10 or 15 years into the future, you would have to build that cash reserve up by charging, in a sense, the current ratepayers. And, maybe what the board would like to do, and it kind of goes along with what Mr. Gormley said, is to say, we are just going to take this $2 million of timber revenue, and rather than use it to fund the current year's capital, but take it and set it aside into that repair and replacement account and let it build. And that's an option. And then what would happen is the current capital plan, which we have listed here, would then be funded through either rates or possibly debt, although I don't think you need debt. But it would mean a higher rate adjustment than what I have in the projection. See, you're a complicated, more of a complicated water system. Complicated from the standpoint you have this in a good way, because you get this timber revenue. And then the question becomes how to use it. I know that the philosophy is to use it for capital improvements, but the question then becomes: is it the current capital, what I have listed here, or is it set aside for that future major capital item that's 10 or 15 years down the road?
Thank you.
So Mark, a couple things. One is that we are currently in our capital plan expending funds for our future water source.
Yeah.
For example, we spent $3 million for a water right, and we have future plans. So part of that capital plan already includes a significant amount of that capital that we'll need for those capital improvements. Are already incorporated in that plan.
Yeah.
And so, for example, right now we've spent probably close to, with our water rights and the property purchases, we probably spent close to $7 million for that future water treatment plant or second source. The other thing I was going to mention on the slide where you had the depreciated value, depreciation of the system.
Yeah.
If we allowed that to grow and basically said we're gonna do less capital, so that number grows over time. The problem with that allowing that to grow is we then have to have more staff to maintain the system.
Yeah.
Because we're going to have more water main breaks.
Yeah.
So that means that we have to have more staff on call to do
Yeah.
that. So that's one of the advantages of having a system that is fairly new, is that our staffing is not high like other utilities would.
That's a good point. You're absolutely right.
Commissioner
Newer
Gormley?
systems are more stable.
Commissioner Gormley?
Mark, the 27% number, has all sorts of interesting aspects of it. But I think that if we look at our property, we have 4 or 5 items that are extremely expensive that have been recapitalized. One is the dam raise, that's millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
One is the Scott treatment plant. Another is the big large bore piping we ran underneath the and through the hill in that. And so those things are huge dollars, and so that number shows low, but we have sections of our system that we just say a prayer every night that we don't have something break loose. We've got some real Achilles heels out there, and John and staff have identified those. So the number looks great at 27, but the reality is we got some things out there that really could create some terrible problems for us. Second thing is I'm trying to think. Did we engage you to work on an SDC study for us, or is that somebody else?
That was another company.
Yeah, that was somebody else.
Okay, so I think it's another thing that's going to play as we grow, and you're concerned about making those of us here today pay for the future and that tomorrow. And there's some inherent, it's always going to happen. It's just the nature of it. But I like your thinking. But as John said, we have got an unbelievable amount of capital things that are coming forward. And as we start to begin the Willamette stuff, each year is going to be a little, more and more money we spend. So
Well,
that's all I've got.
what I'm hoping is that the SDC study will generate with the new growth funds that would normally be set aside specifically earmarked for certain capital that needs to be expended. And you had mentioned the dam and the treatment plant. I know you're looking right now at spending a lot of money on the transmission system, in enlarging that. And all of that goes into that SDC calculation. And the SDC calculation is good, and there's a bad to it also. And the good is it makes growth, in a sense, pay for the future impacts. The downside of it is that if those system development charges are set at a level that's substantially high, it can minimize or limit the potential growth of the community. So now that becomes a philosophical question at that point that the commission's going to have to think about after the SDC study is completed, because sometimes we do the SDC studies and the results are so high that the governing body doesn't feel it's in the best interest of the community to set them at that level. So, and that's something that of course you have to make that decision at some point in the future. But the good part of it is that will be additional funds that can be used to fund the capital. But again, to some degree, it comes back to the cash reserve policy, because with those SDC funds, the cash available to the utility is going to grow. And the question then becomes, do you want to create buckets, so to speak? In other words, a bucket for an SDC, which is putting cash into that account, and a cash for repair and replacement of existing infrastructure, and then a cash reserve for your operations. And I think that might be something that a cash reserve policy would help you to sort out.
So Mark, one of the things staff is working on right now is our zone 3 and zone 2 issues.
Yeah.
And the board has, I think, made it pretty clear that we don't think that the current ratepayers should have to pay to build, another storage tanks to deal with the gravity situations that they don't have, the pumping and all that. And so, those SDCs can be high. They will be high because they're not normal because of the topography of the ground and the fact that you got to put storage in. And it's probably going to be a certain amount of hindrance. But likewise, the board doesn't think we should be dealing with some of that. Now, what happens then is, in order for this to happen, somebody's going to have to finance that infrastructure. And I think in the end, it's probably going to be us. We're going to have a bunch of stranded money sitting out there until lots sell and, we collect the SDCs. So that'll be something that you'll probably weigh in on in the future, is us being in the finance business.
Correct. What a lot of systems will do is they create that SDC fund within the water utility. And let's say that you have all those expenses. Let's say it's $10 million, right? And the SDC is set usually based on projected growth over like a 10-year period. And so the SDC is then set. And as those revenues come in, it's used to directly offset that $10 million of capital expenditures to try to minimize the impacts on the existing ratepayers. It'd be interesting. We'll see how the SDC study comes out, but maybe we should wait until that study is completed before we do a cash reserve policy.
That'd be a good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on the plant depreciation. Is the depreciation rate set by a national or a government standard accounting practice, or is that up to the individual utility, the rate at which it depreciate the plant, since that specific line has so much impact on this overall report?
It does. And there's not a real clear answer to your question. There are general guidelines and recommendations, and of course, we did look at that, and we felt your assessment was reasonable. Your auditors, when your audits are done, will also look at that and give their comments to staff. So my overall belief is that your current depreciation rates that you're using are reasonable compared to other utilities.
And when you're talking about those rates, you would be talking about certain assets have certain rates.
Yeah, they're
Correct.
based on classes of assets. Yeah.
For example, pipes in the ground can be 50 years. Some utilities use 100 years. Some use 75. And it depends on what they feel is appropriate for their area. You know, you get into pumps, those are normally like 20 years. You know, it just depends on what the auditing firm and the finance director of the utility feels is an appropriate number.
Thank you. Additional questions from the commission?
Mark, did you want to go through those two rate tracks?
Yes, I do. This is one of the things, and what we did is we designed the rates for a 2% increase. And we were requested to do a 4-year rate track, all right? And so we have that in this study, you'll see it. Then the question becomes, do you want to do the first year of the increase in 2023 or delay it to 2024? So the rate track would then look like this. And from my perspective, from looking at the cash reserves, you know, either one will keep the utility financially stable. Of course, with the first track, you have a little bit more cash than you do in the second one, about 700,000 more. So that's the first question that you need to think about. It doesn't, obviously, it's not something you have to make a decision about now because we designed the rates at the 2%. The main question I have is, do you feel the 2% is an adequate adjustment?
So Mark, just doing the rough math, if it were nothing this year and then, and we only set rates for a 2-year period, right?
On electric, we do
Water?
water, we usually do a 4.
Or do 4, okay, so if we wanted to do it, say, nothing for 2023, and the next 3 years, 2.5%. So we get back a good chunk of what we didn't do.
Yeah.
Would that mess the numbers up dramatically, or would that give us sort of a reasonable growth of our cash balance?
Well, it would look more like this scenario. It'd probably add about 800,000 because that would add the 2% back into it.
And when we come back, we can have him have that scenario.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Please.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, I guess maybe to Tom and Ed, or it seems like there was already a discussion at some time earlier about needing to have these recurring rate increases over the next few years, and was that tied to capital improvement plans that were coming up, or how was, because it feels like this was already a formula that was discussed at some other time.
This is similar to what we did the last time. The previous rate track.
Okay.
So this is
Which
very
was
similar.
4 years ago.
It was actually 4 years ago.
And so you did this a similar 2-year every year?
Well, so what we did is electric was every 2 years because that ties in with the BPA rate track.
Mhm.
Water used to be every 5 years, but then what would happen is we would get water and electric together. So we're trying to do a 4-year where 1 year is water, 1 year is electric, so they're offsetting each other.
But this is every year.
Right, but it's doing the cost of service. So keeping the cost of service offsetting, so we're not doing both in the same year. But, these are the rate tracks, and then every year we come back to the commission, yes, do you want to continue doing this, or do you want to do something different? So,
So Kathy, I think to answer, because I understood your question, is it about, I mentioned something about this long-term study we talked about, is that what the question was? Yeah, when we started, as I recall, and Ed, you can help me, or John, when we started the idea of the Willamette source and we got serious about it,
Mhm.
we looked at what it was going to cost and in kind of a long term, and what should you do with rates about this, and we heard a lot like what Mark talked about today, that if you had to charge enough rates to recover those costs so that you emerge debt free with that source, you'd probably be charging people too much now. But I think we also talked about, we wanted to pay for what we could as we went, and so that discussion was there. And so does that answer it a little better? Or?
and I think the other item that plays into this is our master plan, our water master plan. So, that was done in 2011. And so a lot of the capital that you see in here is from that master plan. And so that talks about zone 2, it talks about a number of the transmission main. And so all of those items were incorporated in the master plan. What's happening now is construction costs are rising. So for example, the transmission main, there's about 54,000 feet of that. We broke it into 8 phases. Originally it was 4 phases, but the problem is that cost has gone, and the master plan was originally $24 million. Now we're estimating to complete it, it's $40 million. And so we're seeing those substantial increases in capital costs to get these projects done. So what we're doing is trying to break them into smaller bites so that we're not trying to take on such a big bite.
And another thing, Kathy, I think is that I think we found Mark's services to be valuable, but they're also not free. And so because he looks at things deeply, so what we've done is we don't want to do this every year. So like in water, I guess it's 4 years. Every 4 years, Mark does this, and then each year we look at it to see whether, our costs have gone way up or our revenues have gone way down, and we may have to go off this track. So it's just this is what we're thinking about doing, and then we kind of play it against what our experience has been, and then 4 years later, Mark will come back and tell us we did fine.
Commissioner Gormley.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a prior commitment that I need to be leaving here shortly, and I just want to comment, Kathy. We have a lot of flexibility with these rates being where they're at, and as Tom said, 0.5% 1 year gets us back in the game. John, I have a concern, and we will know, I think, when we finally go to hearing, or not hearing, when we vote on this, that the same customers that we sell water to also have sewer fees and things like that. And I'm concerned about there may be some other potential rate increase that they experience. And it would be nice if we could potentially forego at least one rate period to help some of those people get adjusted to that. And I have no idea, John, if you have any idea what potential costs might be to one of our customers. We'll say some of our fixed customers in that, but I think Kathy gives some flexibility.
If you go to this other slide, that was what Mark was trying to show, is potentially not having a rate increase for 23.
Yeah.
And because of those other things that are coming along.
Okay. So I think that gives the board plenty of flexibility there in that. So,
right. And that's what
Mark, thank you. Madam Mayor, hate to have to leave. I know there's some good discussion you have to follow in that. So please excuse me, and And good luck with the meeting. Thank you all.
If I could just have
Thank
one
you.
second at a time, Mr. Gormley. I wanted to
Go
mention that 2% adjustment on a 5/8" meter at a usage of about 6 CCFs or 7 CCFs is around 50 cents a month, 50 to 7,
Okay.
less than 75. So we're not talking about a lot of money.
And we continue to have second or third lowest rates in the state, based on some information John provided here a week or so ago, I believe. So, so we were, and that's always a concern to the board, has been how competitive are we as we interplay with all the other departments within the city and economic development, et cetera. So anyway, thank you all. Sam, thanks for the information today, and John, thanks for your help today.
Thank you.
Commissioner. Are there any other questions of the commission for staff? Or for the presenter?
Boy, I think they wanted to talk about inside and outside the city, and I have
right.
a quick question on that is, don't we charge a higher rate outside the city already? And will looking at this make a difference, or, I mean, or are we already there with that double rate we traditionally charge? In other words,
So Mark, do you have those slides? You can show the difference between the inside, outside,
I do. I think I'm showing what you're referring to now. What you're seeing here is the water cost of service results. If we applied the timber revenue to everybody, including the outside city. So what you see here is the outside city getting basically a minus 9.3%. And I did factor in a higher what's called rate of return on them of around 3% premium, which is traditional for outside city. If we keep the timber revenues and just apply it to inside city, then the outside city has to go up about 19%, theoretically. Not that we would do it to that degree, but from a cost of service results perspective. And when it comes to the actual rates, let me go, probably easier to see it on this slide. The outside city commodity rate, you can see is 3.52 cents currently. The cost of service when we apply the timber revenue is 3.19. Inside city is 1.76. But if we take the timber revenue out, their rate goes up to 4.19. And the inside city goes down to 1.74. Again, it's not a decision that you need to make now. Right now, the way your rate is set, you're kind of in between the two. So it's like you're giving them credit for some of the timber revenue. Because it's a minus 9% with the timber revenue credit, it's 19% increase without the timber revenue.
Mark, first of all, on the previous slide, don't we sort of say if it's within 10%, it's close enough because there are so many other variables involved?
You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's correct.
And then the second question is, how many dollars are we talking about here if you use it the way the second slide shows?
We're not talking about a lot. You don't have that many customers outside the city.
So would it be reasonable for us to say, we've always had a double rate, we've always had a double rate, this is quite close, it comes fair to approximating. And then we have another complication in that we have our wholesale rates are based on, well, they're based on the inside the city rate.
They're
Yeah,
based on the outside.
they're not based on their big on the inside. So that
Yeah.
wouldn't be. So I guess that isn't a factor. They just happen to approximate it in some cases. So
Yeah.
I think we need to deal with this.
I think we're fine. I mean, we're already at 2 times, and I think that's, I know we had a customer come and complain about that last year, I think.
Was it an inside the city customer or outside?
He was outside.
Oh, okay.
That was John Abrams.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, and so you know, he was arguing that the rate should be more like the inside city rate,
Right.
but I think that this
This
is
is-
fair,
And we have this information now, we've looked at it,
and we didn't have that before.
and his rates would actually go up if we follow that. logic.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
I wanted to go, just briefly, I did the same thing with the meter charges. And, what, the main one, most of your customers are 5/8 to 3/4. And your current fixed monthly rate is $14.30. Cost of service study came out real close at $14.39. Now, some of the others show increases. So when we went to the rate design, we tried to take this into account and move some of these meter sizes toward that cost of service, but trying to be cognizant in a sense of the impacts that would have on the customers in that class. So if I were to go, I'm going to come back to, this is the rate design that we had proposed, the 4-year rate structure to get to 2%. Inside city, we proposed about a 4-cent increase each year, and similar increase outside the city, a little bit more because, like I said, it's a 2 times multiplier. So just a modest 2% adjustment on the consumption rates, 2.1% out here. And then on the customer charges, inside city, or the 5/8 inside the city, we just increased them like 25 cents each year. And of course, in year 4, they're at $15.30. The cost of service is $14.55, but that's the current cost of service. In 4 years, it most likely will be higher. And you can see that the increases that we gave over here to the different customer charges was to try to move toward that cost of service result. And you can see we got very close to the 1 inch, but the 1.5 inches, even with the 3.6% increase, we're not quite there yet. So we're going to have to continue this process, on the next study. The same thing with the 2 inch. You see the 3 inch, which is currently at 146, cost of service is about 117. So we kept them the same. We froze their customer charges. So we use the cost of service results for guidance in the rate design process. And as I mentioned before, I did the calculations for a typical residential. It's between 50 and 75 cents a year increase in the rates. It's not a substantial adjustment at all. But there is one other area that.
Excuse me, Mark, before you move off that one, do we need to do this one over 4 years, or can that be over 3 years if we decided to do that and no change the first year? Does that get to be too big a change?
Well, what would happen is if you didn't do the increase in the first year, this would be your year 2 increase right here. And year 2 would be your year 3 increase, and then year 3 would be your year 4.
But I think what Tom was saying is maybe we want to look at, instead of 2%, looking at 2.5%.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that may get us where we want at the end.
Yeah.
I
And
think
you could do that, Mark, with
Oh, yeah.
the usage charge and the meter charge would be just over at the 2.5% rate over the last 3 years of the 4-year period, right?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah. And we can certainly do that. I just want to give you one little heads up. What's going to happen is the 5/8 inches probably can go up a little bit more, but the 1 inch, these numbers are probably going to go up at least 0.5%, just so you're aware of that. So like an 1.5 inch meter charge will probably go up about 4%. So I just want to give you that heads up when we do that. But we'll go back and design the rates at the 2.5.
And most of those, you know, 1.5 and well, all the 1.5 and above are commercial. We have
Yeah.
some 1 inch residential, but most of those are commercial too.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't like see a number of affected customers or the revenue associated,
With
you know,
each meter
with
class.
each meter class, which would make it seem less daunting, maybe if you saw that everybody was mostly in that first two classes.
Right. And we have that data, so we can maybe Mark, if you could have a slide that showed the number of customers in each meter class.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can, yeah. I have that data readily available.
And I think the other request was for associated revenue impact.
Normally, we'll show that for like a typical residential. When it comes to commercial or industrial, it's very difficult. And the reason it's difficult, I mean, we can give you a range actually pretty easily, because there isn't an average, because like a commercial, some may use just a little bit of water and some may use a lot. But we'll try to give you a range of impacts
Well,
percentage-wise.
and part of our problem too is when we get into the 6 and 8 inch meters, we have only one customer that has an 8 inch. So it's really, you know, it's one customer.
Right.
And so those, you know, you have as you get past the 3 inch, 4, and you get into the 4, 6, and 8, there's very few customers in those. So.
Yeah. One of the things too, like if you were to take like a 2-inch meter, for example, in year one, the customer charge went up 3.3%, and the commodity rate went up 2%. So they're going to be somewhere between 2% and 3% increase, which kind of gives you just a reasonableness check. Because nobody can have an increase greater than that 3.3% per 2-inch. And the reason is because the commodity rate's only at a 2% increase.
Thank you. Do you want to keep going the rest of the way through the?
Yes. Probably the last item, I think this is my last one yet, is the zone 2. Now-
Excuse me for a second. I'm gonna make it clear that I'm not participating in the discussion of zone 2. I have a conflict. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, the zone 2, because the way we ran the analysis is that rather than building the reservoir to maintain water pressure in that area, that we would increase the sizing on the transmission lines. And then we'd have additional pumping costs to pump the water up. I think it's about 350 feet, something like that elevation, to maintain the water pressure in that area. So what we did is we looked at the pumping costs, we looked at the electricity to run the pump, and also the cost to maintain that pump. And so we use that as an adder because the other customers don't have that. We also looked at an allocated portion of the transmission mains. And we did that because the cost of service study identifies the average peak, in a sense, that each customer needs, residential customer. So using that, we're able to allocate the cost of the transmission lines. So that said that we need to recover about $1.4 million from these customers. Now, buried within the rates from the customer that we're going to be charging those customers up there, there's a fixed cost recovery buried in the rate, you know, because the rate of $1.60, for example, variable costs are probably 25 cents or 50 cents. All the rest is margin, theoretically. But we didn't use all the margins. We only used the margins on the distribution infrastructure that's being generated. And we looked over a 20-year period and we projected out the growth. Well, we didn't, it was the engineering firm, and said, okay, that area is going to return a present value contribution toward infrastructure that's currently in the ground of about $1 million. So we need to recover an additional 300,000 from those customers. The that says kilowatt hour, I apologize. That's actually meant to say CCF. Sales over 40-year period, sorry, was 146 million CCFs. So the current, the CCF premium to recover that 300,000 is an add-on of 0.002. You're currently at 0.0174, which means that they would have to go up to 1.947. Rather than doing this calculation each year, I think it best just to say, we're going to increase their rates by approximately 12% above the other customers that are not at that elevation. So if we charge these rates, so to speak, for these rates, that they would be charged a 12% premium on these rates. And I think that's a reasonable number, and it will allow you to recover your additional investments.
Is the Zone 2 analysis based on complete development of Zone 2
Over that 40-year period.
over that 40-year period?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, was it 930 some odd lots, Mark? Is that what we told you?
I think so. I can, if you, I'm gonna pull up the spreadsheet, if that's all right. Yeah, 938.
So there's some SDC, where do SDCs
They're not.
potentially fit in there? They're not in there right now.
Correct.
right? So that's an offset or something that we have to look at.
Correct.
And is the maintenance plan that you mentioned layered into which of these other items? It's not a transmission cost, it's not a pumping cost, is the maintenance incorporated into the annual pumping cost?
It is, it's right here. We had to make an assumption. The developer is going to install the pumps at a cost of approximately $1.2 million. But McMinnville is going to be responsible for the eventual replacement of that and the maintenance of it. And so we assumed a 2% maintenance charge. So in other words, an annual maintenance fee of $24,400 on the pumps. That was an assumption that we used in the analysis.
What's the expected life cycle on a piece of equipment like this?
Probably closer to, what do you think, 20 years?
I would say, yeah, 20 years.
Yeah.
You'll have to replace impellers and motors at some point on the pumps.
Now this is something that's probably is going to be sound a little weird in a way. But you see this $1.2 million, because the developer is paying for that and not the city of McMinnville ratepayers. I don't want to charge them back for that 1.2 million. Now, after 20 years, when we have to fund the replacement of that pump, that should then be added as an additional charge to them, that replacement cost. The reason I don't include that now is because I would be double charging them over that 20-year period, because the developer is paying for it up front And if we charged it back to them over that 20-year period, we have basically recovered another $1.2 million. And so they would have paid for it twice over that period of time. So to prevent that, we're not charging them the depreciation expense on that pump.
So
I
water,
am, oh, sorry,
water and light will essentially fund that when it comes time to replace that.
correct. What I am charging them though, it isn't just the 24,000. It's also the inflation on that. So remember I talked about the rate of return? So I'm charging them another $37,000 for that investment in that pump. Not to fully recover the replacement cost, but to recover the inflationary increase in that replacement cost.
Commissioner Tate?
I'm sorry, I was just wondering why you wouldn't factor that, the pump replacement, the 20-year pump replacement in from the beginning of the use.
Because the developer paid for it.
I know, but
Upfront.
I'm not saying the full recovery, but like a maintenance
He's,
piece.
he's got that in there. That's the,
And so wouldn't the idea be that it would be enough maintenance fee that at the end of 20 years, you've collected enough money to not have to pass along another 1 point, to not have to factor, pass along the cost, because it seems like the people that are starting to use it today should be paying the bulk of
and,
the
and,
replacement in 20 years, right?
and they would, because basically somebody paid for it, the developer paid for it before there was any ratepayers there.
Right.
And so then that got funded. So we're, as ratepayers come on, that's being used.
Mhm.
And what Mark's saying is that if we charge them a depreciation expense on that every year, essentially you'd be double charging.
I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying. I'm just saying, if you built in from the beginning, the cost of eventually replacing it, that would go into a fund for that,
I think what we're saying is that what'll happen is when that fails, let's say it fails, then Water and Light will replace it, and then we'll start that process again. And they will pay for that.
the depreciation. of the
Depreciation.
next pump that goes in.
Correct. Yeah. It's just kind of perpetual, I guess, at that point.
Yeah.
And that will be built back into the rate.
Yeah, it becomes a fairness issue, but when there are lawsuits on water rates, it's oftentimes centered on the double charging of contributed capital. So of course, I don't want you guys to get into that situation.
Thank you. Are there other questions from commissioners? Or you're not participating? Great, thank you. Are there any questions of staff, for staff or by staff?
Do we have any interested parties that have any questions? I mean, I don't know if there's anybody online. More.
Yeah.
Back there.
Yep, I'm getting there. Do we have any interested parties questions? Mark Davis, please state your name and address for the record.
You want me to do it from here or come up there?
Please join us. I have a seat here, seat there.
Thank you, Mark. Of course. Mark Davis, 652 Southeast Washington Street. I'd like to ask a couple of questions of Mr. Beauchamp, if I could.
Please.
The first question is, what percentage of public water utilities in the United States, just roughly, what percentage are debt-free?
That's a difficult question. I can only give you my experience, and I would probably take it closer to most have some sort of debt. I'd probably guess 50 to 75% of the utilities do have debt.
So we're kind of in a unique category here. Okay. And the
You
second,
are- Yeah, you're a unique system, very unique.
And the second question, I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but there's a city services fee being considered that we've talked about that would have an impact, as I understand it, that would require some programming to be done by Water and Light and maybe some additional staffing to handle it. Is that cost going to wind up in the customer service charge when you do your cost of service analysis?
I think I can address that, or perhaps legal counsel can, but I think that would be separate and apart than anything that's in this or correlated to this presentation or any of these rates.
Well, but he always is, I mean, one of the complaints I generally have with rates are that he's charging all these things, putting them into the customer service charge. And I'm just curious how he would analyze the customer service charge if, there were additional costs.
So I guess what I would say is, if that does move forward, we would be looking at cost recovery, not through rates.
Okay, so that in essence, it would not have an impact on the customer service charge. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other interested parties' questions? Are there any staff? Are there any raised hands on Zoom?
There are not.
Thank you. Are there any interested parties on the phone? There are not.
No.
Do any commissioners have questions of any of the interested parties?
No, thank you.
Right, thank you. And so we will now continue this public hearing until September 20th, 2022 at 5:00 p.m. right.
Thank you for your help, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. And if there's any questions, we have to go back and design rates at 2.5%, and to also include the number of customers in each rate category. So we have those two things.
And the associated revenue to the best of ability, but specifically on the smallest size pipe, which is the primarily residential sized or meter, I'm sorry, which is the residential size. And that's where the most data is, I understand from your presentation.
Correct. And you're talking about the impacts on a typical customers, right?
Correct. And that was the request from Commissioner Tate.
Madam Mayor, can I just have you accept his presentation into the hearing record? And we'll reflect that in the minutes.
Absolutely. Now accept this presentation by Utility Financial Solutions LLC into the record. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks a lot.
Beauchamp. Appreciate it.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Our next item this evening is property liability workers' comp insurance renewal. And again, Mr. Dunmeyer, Finance Director, please present this agenda item.
Thank you. This evening for us is our annual property liability insurance renewal, as well as work comp rates.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. Go ahead. Thank
Okay,
you.
so with us this evening is Mr. Gary Eastland of Hagan Hamilton Insurance to present our renewal for us. So,
Wonderful, thank you.
come forward, Gary. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, Mr. Eastland.
How are you? Madam Mayor, first time I've seen you at this table, so that's really nice to see you here. I'll see you again next week. I think everybody had the revised stewardship report. And we did get a clarification on the one item that we didn't have the price on, and that is the fiduciary liability. And I'll go through the whole report here, just kind of touch on the highlights of it. But the fiduciary liability premium actually came in. The estimate that you had plugged in, I believe, was
Yeah, on the staff report. we had.
5,800.
5,800.
Yep.
And it actually came in at 5,414. So it's a little bit under that estimate. We expected it to be up a little bit. But that's in line with what we're seeing with fiduciary liability. We're seeing almost all, as you probably noticed, almost all lines of insurance are increasing right now. Properties, probably the biggest increase because of the reinsurers, wildfire exposures worldwide, and a lot of the other factors that they take into consideration. But that said, CIS has done a pretty amazing job of renegotiating their reinsurance contracts. There are some increases which are not insignificant. In looking down at all the coverages, I'm just going to touch on all these different policies so that you understand what each one represents. But the city county insurance services provides the property, the liability, the autos, mechanical breakdown, which is built into the property. Workers' compensation is provided by SAFE, and Landmark American provides the excess earthquake. The CIS policy includes a base limit of 20 million. The Landmark American provides excess of 30 million excess to 20 for a total of 50 million. It gets a little bit confusing when you're trying to add up those numbers. Great American, actually the Great American is a fiduciary liability policy, which we just talked about. The last item, which we won't have numbers to present tonight, is the cyber. The cyber is the most dynamic of all these coverages. It's a real major concern from a risk management perspective, and it's getting really expensive. We're seeing some tremendous increases on this. HDI Global, which is a company which we've been with for a few years, has maintained a very competitive rate. Prior to that, we had Philadelphia Insurance, which was about 4 or 5 times more expensive back in 2012 when we first started. And then we were actually got a little break from HDI, but now we're seeing it go. HDI has exited the marketplace. They didn't get adequate premium. And now we're seeing the 17, 18 carriers that are now in that market are taking two things. They're underwriting it very significantly to make sure everybody has multi-factor authentication. I always want to throw an F in there. I guess it's acceptable, but it's harder to say. Anyway, that's causing a lot of frustration because sometimes we can't even get the limits we had before. And sometimes we can get the limits and they're very expensive. And so I'll bring that to the next meeting, all the options. But we expect to have, it'll be across the board, including a increased limit quote from city county insurance services. Okay, so that said, you want me to go forward?
Well, maybe it would be good for the mayor is to have a little explanation on why we have an excess earthquake.
Yeah, and I have a couple other questions as well.
Sure, and we can just take it, let's go ahead and ask as we go, because right now I'm just going to go into the numbers a little bit. So if you want to just ask questions.
Sure, thank you. How many providers are there kind of in the marketplace for cybersecurity insurance?
18.
Wow, okay. And then are there any consolidated services?
There are a number of other markets that do like supplemental coverage. They'll throw it in and you'll see it like in a business, private business. They'll maybe throw in 50,000 or 100,000. Most of the ones that are committed to this, some of them are coalitions. One of them is actually called Coalition, and there are a number of different London markets that are combining and trying to just focus strictly on cyber. They're trying to determine what the exposures are, what to expect, because it's constantly changing, and then that's they're trying to create a stability from pricing, but even more so, there is no standardized forms. So every cyber policy is different. They're all, they may as well be manuscripts because they kind of copy each other to a degree, and they're getting to be a little bit more consistent, but they're not standardized like property and liability forms that have been standardized for years. But so it's a very dynamic marketplace. So.
And then please on the excess 20 million, that would be wonderful.
Okay, on the earthquake, basically, the reason, are you looking why we have it in the first place, or is that kind of what your base question is? That's been an interesting conversation for many years. We actually started looking at the earthquake back when the dam, about the time we had raised the dam, because it's such a major investment or asset, and it's a number one concern from most of the people in the conversation was the earthquake. And so the city county insurance services always provided a little bit of coverage, and actually it was 10 million originally. And so we were able to get them to bump it up to 20 million, but they wouldn't go any higher than that, and they haven't been able to send. Well, actually, they did come in with a competitive bid a couple of years ago to raise it up to 50. But we had already had this policy in place, which would go excess the 20 million to get us up to 50 million. And that was actually quite a bit more competitive than what CIS was able to offer for the full 50 million. So we kept it in place. There are some of the board members, and the thing about everything, what we have to discuss is the decision makers, all the leaders need to have a different appetite for risk. Some people don't want to, hey, if an earthquake happens, it happens. I'm not gonna pay premium for something that we, really don't know if it'll happen now or 100 years from now. We know it's probably going to happen based on the models. But at that time, Mike Keyes was on the council, and he was one of the ones that really was pushing for this. And his comment, Tom probably remembers, is he said, buy as much earthquake as you can afford, because you're not always going to be able to even buy it, period. And you never know, it could happen tomorrow and it might not. But he felt like it was something that should be factored into the risk expense. And so I think the board is pretty much, been in line with that. I don't know for sure. We haven't had any really serious objections in the past, but it is something that has been discussed every year. And so it is an option,
Right.
obviously.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if this is in here, but what kind of, how long has McMinnville Water and Light been with SAFE?
Actually, just 2 years. This will be the second year. SAFE actually, last year, all of the city county programs were moved, or CIS made an arrangement to move all their work comp to SAFE. And it was on a paid loss retro up until last year, but we were able to actually move it to a guaranteed cost plan for just within a few $1,000s. It was an opportunity to move to a guaranteed cost plan and eliminate all the future costs of paid loss retro, which goes on for 5 years basically. And that's and so that was accepted by the board last year.
Great. And then has the utility seen monies back from SAFE in?
No, not yet. No, the dividends are usually paid out after the expected losses are all paid. So usually like SAFE will pay dividends at some point in time. Now there is a group which has already given us a discount for the city county insurance services members that had under a 1.0. Not everybody qualified for it. So last year, the discount was about, this year, basically, that discount is 2,000 as a 0.94 factor. So in this particular case, it's a $2,900 approximately discount that's built into that. And that is a group which is, they're called, you're probably familiar with the OGSRP. There's about, I think, 8 or 9 different groups in Oregon that SAFE is qualified. and they do pay dividends, and they do, in addition to what SAFE pays. And so it is something that's, it's designed specifically for the CIS group members. And so you have your own risk management team, return to work teams, all those things are specifically dedicated to this group to help it become more and more competitive. Now, some of the times, if you have experience which takes you outside of the group, then you won't get the discount anymore, but you could still stay in and get the services until you qualify again. So that's the way the group discounts work.
Okay. And then how is our workplace safety?
I think what were we like?
Excellent.
Excellent.
We're at 0.6.
Points, it dropped to a 0.60, which is probably one of the lowest, if not the lowest experience mod of any of my accounts, private end. And I mean, this is not, this is an industry which doesn't lend itself to that low of a mod, but it's exemplary. And let me just see the exact number here, say.
0.64 to 0.6.
Yeah, last year was 0.64 and this year's 0.60, and your premiums aren't that high. So it wouldn't take, I mean, when you're paying a $40,000 annual premium, one back injury can pretty much wipe that out, and that will hurt you for 3 or 4 years, basically. So it is exemplary.
So experience modification factor is accident.
Yes, actually, the easiest way to explain that is it starts out at a 1.0, which basically means that's the amount of premiums taken in is the same as the amount of claims paid out. And that's an oversimplification, but it's a 4-year history. They don't use the most recent year because the claims haven't developed yet. So then what happens is at the end of the year, then the most recent year drops in and the oldest year drops out. So on a paid loss retro, like you were on before, you paid a percentage of the deposit premium. So if the deposit premium is 100,000, you pay 25,000 or 30, depending on the program. And then as the losses come in, they bill you back. So you're always paying those losses out as they are paid by the insurance company. And it's quite honestly, I always told Water and Light that they were in a dangerous, precarious position on a paid loss retro, because you could like have one of those big claims or two. Now, even though there are caps on them, you still could be in a position where you pay 3-4 times what you would pay under a guaranteed cost plan. But it's been very well managed. So, and so I felt it was a good time to go. And actually for the city this year, just to share that with you, because it's all public, they moved to a guaranteed cost line for the first time, and it saved a lot of money because they locked it in. They don't have to pay for all the COVID losses, which is significant what came out there. Now, last thing on COVID is unique is that they aren't going to put those COVID losses in that experience mod. So that's an NCCI ruling. So they won't hurt you as bad as a back injury type situation, but they do, if you're on a paid loss retro, you would have had to repay them. And so it was a pretty good timing to go to a guaranteed cost plan.
That's all my questions for now. Any other commissioners have a question?
I have just a couple questions. The $50 million for the dam insurance, is that then, when's the last time that was looked at as far as the amount of coverage that we have?
It was kind of one of those things. It was the most we could buy because at the time, I think we have it's about $150 million property schedule. And it covers, and so we could go out, but it was exponentially higher for each layer above that.
So that 50 million, is that replacement value, or is that damages associated as well with the dam break?
It is, that's another good question, because under the earthquake form, it's not a true replacement value, but at the same time, it is a functional replacement value. So all that means is if they can do it cheaper now, they will. So it's something that they will come in, and it's a very high deductible also. Actually, the deductible is not as high as in the private industry. A lot of times we have a 10% or 20% deductible. So that means 20% of the entire schedule. So if you have a situation here where we have I believe it's $100,000 fixed deductible on this. Do you remember? Yeah. So it is a fixed deductible on this. So, but it is a separate deductible that'll be applied on each layer. We have to look at that, and I can get into the details. It is, but the thing about it is, it's one of those things that was more of a catastrophe type situation, whereas something is better than not having it at all.
It just seems weird, like a catastrophe in the sense that there's the potential whole community has no drinking water, right? Like it's not, I mean, we're working on alternatives, right?
Right.
For that, but the damages are not just losing the reservoir. right?
Absolutely.
It's the, yeah.
And then how does, how do you even put a value on that? How do you assess that?
And we've actually done some risk management surveys, which have been put together in the past to see what is the things that could happen that are uninsurable. And a big part of that was how, a lot of the lines, basically, we added the underground lines to the property schedule so that it would be triggered, because it's not going to get caught, it's not like it's going to catch on fire. But at the same time, in order to coverage for the earthquake, we had to add it to the policy. Now, we don't do the overhead power lines. We can order those, and we don't do some of the other things by design because they're not as susceptible to either the catastrophe or the individual loss. They'd always be under the deductible because they're so spread out if something like happened to them. So there's a lot of risk management analysis. You're absolutely right. It's not just because you get $50 million, that's not going to come close to covering the cost of replacing the water or finding an alternative source or all the other things that would go into trying to make sure that it does help mitigate them.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. I think my other question just was around the 50% increase for the comprehensive liability insurance.
Right.
I was just wondering, is that, there's a lot of capital expenditures that go on throughout the year that obviously are going to increase your rates to cover more things. And is that built in? Is that part of that 15%, or is there an assumption that there's an increase?
Okay, the rate, the two different things that are the rate basis. Okay, 15% is that's the overall rate increase. The property rates probably went up about 25 or 30% because that's only about 50% of the total premium. The general liability rates are based on the services and the operating projections in the budget, and they actually use the one from the prior year because they don't have the current year finalized by when they're doing all the rates. So that isn't, but it's fixed. It's set for the year. It's not auditable. And so that's a little bit different than on the private side, where you can come in and have to pay it based on what your actual sales were or your actual payroll was. But no, it is fixed and it's tied in as part of the renegotiation, and then they actually subsidize it. CIS actually does not pass through all the rate increases. They keep their own funds in place, and they try to keep an excess amount of a couple $1 million, which they can use to offset like years when you have big increases, so they don't have to pass 100% of that through. But it is a fixed quote that you don't have to worry about changes.
And so I think it was it last year we had the insurance came in and actually did a survey of our system. So they did up the value.
Yeah, every 5 years, they do a reappraisal on all the properties over 200,000 in value. Now that's a question too, because here they appraise the substations and how do you come up? I mean, how they come up with these, but it is a guaranteed replacement cost form. So as long as you don't change what they put on there, if they have it insured for 5 million and because of the appraisal's 5 million and it costs 7 million to replace it, that's what the policy will pay. It's very unique in that regard.
Thank you. Do you want to continue on then?
Yeah, let me just jump through the actual price. I mean, you can read this, but I thought it might raise some questions to take it individually. The contribution from the CIS package jumped up 15%, basically, by from 351 last year, 351 to 277 to 402. And that's a little bit lower. You'll see some of a lot of them in that 15 to 20% range. It's a weighted increase. And so if you've had a lot of claims, CIS doesn't subsidize it quite so much. Okay. So that's the main package. And that includes all the updated new construction projects as well. And they do automatically, in between those appraisal years, they automatically increase 2% on all the valuations on the properties. And that also includes the earthquake, up the first $20 million worth of earthquake. Landmark American actually came in with a this would be a relatively conservative increase of 10% this year. We're seeing a lot of risks that they're actually pulling out, or Landmark, not specifically, but earthquake not being available anymore. Or they're coming in with that high 20-25% deductible. So that one I felt was a little bit of a pleasant surprise. Safe, that's a very good renewal because we do have a little higher projected payrolls, and our premium deposit of $44,119 compares to $44,397. So that's nice when you don't have to worry about a big jump there. And once again, this is a guaranteed cost, so it's locked in, which I don't think you mind not having to pay. Well, we're still paying the ones from CIS, but it's a budgeting challenge when you have to figure that out, how to pay those future claims. And the fiduciary we just discussed, we did last year, went out to try to see if we could get that to cover PERS, because basically all this covers is it 2 plans that you have?
Yes.
That are basic legacy plans that have been in place for many years. And so that's all this, and this was required, I think, in one of your, was it one of your
It was the old plan, wasn't it?
accounting
Which
services?
we don't have anymore.
You're talking the fiduciary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so that's fiduciary has actually gotten to be kind of a tough class of business also because of the laws that require the employers to be, they are actually putting employers in a position of justifying or providing more investments or actually guaranteeing the performance of the investments has even gotten to be, it's pretty sad situation in that you can be held accountable for that.
So the fiduciary covers the OSGP.
Right.
Yeah.
And we had a
Not-
legacy plan. Right?
Yeah.
It's pretty much gone.
Yeah. There's nobody that participates.
And once that's all gone, we wouldn't need that anymore. This would be something that, because like I said, we actually tried to find a quote to see if anybody would cover PERS. Nobody would touch it. It's just, it's another one of those situations where, it performs very well and yet it's underfunded in some ways, and everybody thinks it's going to stop some point and they're going to blame the employers for it. And so that's something that's a little time bomb, which everybody's aware of. Okay, the cyber risk policy is one that we had a $2 million limit last year. We did get a quote from CIS, which for $1 million, which is about twice as expensive. So now this year we're getting quotes from CIS for the email you sent me today. And they are offering a little higher limits this year to some, but not very many. But we're also going to all these other markets as well. And they're weird names. I mean, just because it's called Cowbell Cyber doesn't mean that it's not a good company. It is the weirdest name, Bob, but I guess it doesn't offend anybody. Maybe the cows, I don't know.
Thank you. Are there any questions of commissioners? Yeah, that was my
Right.
question too.
Staff will be looking for a motion to approve the 2022-23 insurance program as recommended by Mr. Eastland. That would be for the property liability, workers' compensation, excess earthquake, and fiduciary liability. We understand Mr. Eastland will be coming back next month with a proposal for cyber insurance.
Yes.
So
Call for motion
So moved.
in a second.
Second.
Motion and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you very
And
much.
thank you very much.
It's good to see you.
Good to see
And
you.
I'll
See you
again.
next week.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And then we're going to do something a little
Yes.
out of step here. We're going
Yeah.
to take a break and go into executive session, and then we'll reconvene to finish the meeting. About how long do you think we need for the executive session?
You know, I think if we go ahead and do all of them in the executive session, we'll probably be out for 45 minutes.
Is that what needs
We
to?
can do one. I mean, Mark will just be one. We've got,
Yeah.
we've got three different issues in executive sessions. We have the side, we have the security.
Yeah.
Do you want to do them all at once?
No, let's just do Clark.
Just Clark, okay.
So we got the way on the phone.
All right. So what we'll do is we're going to go into executive session pursuant to ORS 192-660 sub 2 sub F to consider information of records that are exempt from law from public inspection under ORS 192-502 sub 9 relating to confidential privilege records and ORS 40.225 sub 1 sub B attorney-client confidential communications. We do not, I'm not aware if we have any media online, but if we do, they're warned if they stay in the meeting that they're not to disclose any contents of the executive session. And the commission will be coming out of executive session to take any action. And we anticipate with Mr. Balfour, I don't know how much time it'll take, but I'll guess it'll be 20 minutes, I'm guessing. And I will be stepping out as I have a former client conflict on this issue, so I'll be stepping out of the meeting.
Okay, and everybody else in the room
Except for James.
except for James. Wonderful. Well, hopefully we'll be about 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience.